August 15, 1944, 9:32 a.m. Dr. William Gowland, a British metallurgist from the Woolwich Arsenal, stood before a 240mm thick German armor plate, captured from a destroyed Tiger II tank in Normandy. He had just finished the hardness measurements. On the surface, a 302 Brinell hardness rating. Deep in the core, 120mm down, 178 Brinell. Gowland had 30 years of experience in metallurgy. He had developed British tank steels. But this surpassed everything he had ever seen. The Germans had achieved something that should have been theoretically impossible. An extremely hard surface that deflected shells, combined with a tough core that prevented cracks. Normally, one excluded the other. Hard steel is brittle, tough steel is soft, but the Germans had both. In his report, Gowland wrote, "German metallurgy is decades ahead of ours. Even with this sample in front of me, I don't understand how they did it." What followed were 30 years of desperate attempts to replicate the German steel, 30 years of failure, and a story about the most advanced metallurgy of the 20th century. The story doesn't begin in a lab. It begins in Essen, Germany, at Krupp Industries. Krupp, one of the largest steel producers in Europe since 1811, had a centuries-old tradition in metallurgy. In the early 20th century, Krupp focused on armor steel for military shielding. But it wasn't until the 1930s, with the rise of armored warfare, that armor steel became the top priority. The German engineers recognized a problem. Traditional hardened steel was hard enough to deflect shells, but it was brittle. A single hit could cause cracks that spread throughout the entire plate. After several hits, the plate would break apart. Krupp needed a solution, steel that was hard but didn't shatter. The answer lay in a process called face-hardening. But not just any face-hardening, a specially developed, extremely complex method that would become an industrial secret weapon. The secret of Krupp steel, face-hardening, German style. The Krupp process began with the steel composition itself. Traditional armor steel was carbon steel with about 0.3% carbon. The Germans used a more complex alloy, 0.35% carbon, 3.5% nickel, 1.5% chromium, 0.4% molybdenum, traces of vanadium and tungsten. This composition was not a secret. The Allies knew about it, but the composition was only the beginning. The critical step was the heat treatment. Krupp developed a multi-stage process that lasted over 40 hours and precisely controlled temperatures to plus or minus 5 degrees Celsius. That was 1940s precision, without modern computer control. First, the steel plate was heated to 920 degrees Celsius for 8 hours. This is austenitization, where the steel assumes a specific crystal structure. Then came the revolutionary part, selective quenching. Only the surface was rapidly cooled, in an oil bath at exactly 60 degrees Celsius. The cooling rate was critical, 200 degrees per minute for the first 30 seconds, then slower. Too fast, and the surface would crack. Too slow, and it wouldn't be hard enough. This selective quenching hardened only the outer 40-50 millimeters. The core remained warm, cooling slowly. The result, a hard martensitic surface with 300 Brinell over a tough bayonetic core with 180 Brinell. But that wasn't all. After quenching came tempering. The entire plate was reheated again, this time to 550 degrees Celsius for 12 hours. This process reduced internal stresses that would otherwise lead to cracks, without significantly reducing the hardness. Then slow cooling over 20 hours, controlled in a furnace. The end result, armor steel that deflected shells, that didn't splinter, that withstood hit after hit. German Tiger tanks often survived 20-30 hits before the armor failed. Soviet T-34 tanks with traditional hardened steel often failed after 3 to 5 hits. The British discovery, a steel that couldn't be explained. When the British captured their first Tiger tank armor plate in 1944, the excitement was enormous. Finally, they could analyze the German secret. Dr. William Gowland and his team at the Woolwich Arsenal immediately began testing. First, chemical analysis. They determined the exact composition: 0.35% carbon, 3.5% nickel, 1.5% chromium, and so on. Nothing unusual. Alloys that the British also used. Then, hardness measurements. 302 Brinell on the surface. That was higher than anything British steel achieved. British armor steel typically had 260 Brinell. The Germans had 40 Brinell more. That sounds like a little, but in metallurgy that makes a huge difference. Hardness scales are not linear. A difference of 40 Brinell means that the German steel required about 25% more energy to penetrate. That was the difference between a shell that bounced off and one that pierced through. But the shocking thing was the combination. Hard surface, tough core. Gowland tested the toughness with Charpy impact tests. The core had 60 joules of impact energy. British armor steel had 40 joules. The German core was 50% tougher. How was this possible? Gowland consulted his colleagues, metallurgists in the USA, in France. No one understood it. Theoretically, the hardening process that brought the surface to 300 Brinell should have also made the core harder and more brittle. But with the Germans, the core had become softer and tougher. In a confidential report to the British War Office in November 1944, Gowland wrote, "We are facing a metallurgical riddle. The chemical composition is known. The hardness is measurable. But the process that creates this combination is beyond our understanding. I recommend the capture of German metallurgists as a top priority." The American analysis, desperate replication attempts. The Americans began their own analyses in October 1944 after capturing several German tanks in France. The Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts was tasked with replicating the German steel. Dr. John Freeman, chief metallurgist at Watertown, started a project with 30 engineers and a budget of $500,000, a huge budget for 1944. The goal: copy German armor steel. Freeman started with the known composition. His engineers melted steel with exactly the same alloying elements: 0.35% carbon, 3.5% nickel. Everything was identical. Then they tried face hardening. They heated the plates to 1688 degrees Fahrenheit, dunked them in oil to quench the surface, and tempered them at 1022 degrees Fahrenheit. The result? A disaster. The plates cracked during quenching, huge fissures rendering the entire plate useless. John Freeman reduced the cooling rate. The plates stopped cracking, but the hardness rating was only 240 Brinell, 60 points below the German standard. He experimented with different temperatures: 1652 degrees, 1724 degrees, 1760 degrees. Nothing worked. Either the plates cracked, or the hardness was too low, or the core became too brittle. After 6 months, in April of 1945, Freeman had tested 47 different variations. Not a single one met German standards. In his report, he wrote, "The Germans have perfected a process that requires more than just knowledge. It requires decades of experience, precise control on a level we can't achieve, and possibly secret steps that we don't know." The War Office ordered Operation Overcast, the forerunner to Operation Paperclip. German metallurgists had to be found and brought to the United States. The Soviet method? Direct abduction. The Soviets were more pragmatic and more brutal. When they captured the Krupp factory in Essen in April 1945, They didn't just dismantle the equipment, they kidnapped the engineers. Dr. Hermann Schott, chief metallurgist at Krupp Industries, was taken with 42 other engineers to Magnitogorsk in the Soviet Union. There, under guard, they worked in Soviet steel mills, forced to share their knowledge. But even with German engineers on site, the Soviets ran into problems. Dr. Schott knew the process. Yes, but knowledge isn't enough. The Soviet steel mills lacked the same level of quality control. The furnaces were less precise. The quenching baths weren't optimally temperature controlled. The first Soviet attempts to replicate Krupp steel from 1946 to 1947 failed. The hardness rating only reached 260 Brinell. Dr. Schott explained to the engineers that every detail mattered. The oil temperature, the plate size, the cooling rate, the tempering duration. Everything had to be exact. It wasn't until 1950 that the Soviets produced steel that met German standards. And even then, the consistency was problematic. Some plates were perfect, others failed. The industrial control that Krupp had was missing in the Soviet Union. The secret ingredient, experience and industrial perfection. What was the secret that the Allies couldn't copy? It wasn't a secret chemical ingredient. It wasn't an unknown temperature. It was experience and industrial perfection on a level that only decades of systematic work could achieve. Krupp had been working on tank steel since the 1920s. Each year, new trials, new variations, new optimizations. By 1940, they had tested over 10,000 different samples. They knew what cooling rate was optimal for 200-meter plates. They knew how nickel content affected tempering behavior. They knew that oil temperature could vary by 5 degrees, but no more. This knowledge wasn't in books. It was in the minds of the engineers, in the procedures of the workers, in the calibration of the machines. When the Allies tried to copy it, they lacked this experience. They knew the theory, but theory isn't practice. For example, the Germans knew that plates of different thicknesses required different cooling rates. A 240mm plate had to be treated differently than a 120mm plate. The Allies initially treated them all the same. Result? Inconsistency. Another example. The Germans used specific quenching oil, a blend of mineral oil with additives, developed over years. The Allies used standard industrial oil. The cooling rates were different. Result? Lower hardness. A third example. The Germans controlled the atmosphere in the furnace during austenitization. They used a slightly reducing atmosphere to prevent oxidation. The Allies used normal air. Result? Surface contaminants that reduced the hardness. Hundreds of such details, each small together crucial. And the Germans didn't give up these details, even under captivity. They cooperated, yes, but they didn't share everything. Some details were so deeply ingrained in their way of working that they themselves didn't know they were important. The post-war development, a 30-year chase. After the war, a systematic catch-up began. The USA, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, all invested heavily in metallurgical research. The USA founded the Defense Metals Information Center in 1946, later renamed the Defense Technical Information Center. Thousands of pages of German technical documents were translated, analyzed, disseminated. German metallurgists who came under Operation Paperclip worked in American labs. A breakthrough came in 1955 when Dr. Zachary Jenkins from General Electric developed a new method, vacuum heat treatment. By heating in a vacuum instead of a normal atmosphere, he could completely eliminate oxidation and achieve more precise control. The hardness rating rose to 280 Brinell, closer to German standards, but still not quite there. In 1962, Bethlehem Steel developed a new quenching technique, high-pressure gas quenching. Instead of oil, they used high-pressure nitrogen, which allowed for more uniform cooling. The hardness rating reached 290 Brinell, almost German level, but it wasn't until 1974, 30 years after the war ended, that American industry consistently produced tank steel that met German Krupp standards. And even then, they used modified alloys, not the exact same ones as the Germans. The British development followed a similar pattern. By 1970, British steel reached German hardness levels. The Soviets, despite stolen equipment and kidnapped engineers, didn't achieve consistent quality until the late 1960s. 30 years, a whole generation, to replicate a steel whose composition was known from the beginning. That shows just how advanced German metallurgy was from 1940 to 1944. The modern legacy, ballistic steel today. Today, all modern tank steels are based on principles that Krupp developed: face-hardened armor, selective hardening, multi-layer heat treatment. All these concepts originated in Essen in the 1940s. Modern American tank steels, like RHA, rolled homogeneous armor, use similar alloys to Krupp steel. Modern German Leopard 2 tanks use composite armor, but the steel components still follow Krupp principles. British Challenger tanks, Soviet T-90s, all use face-hardening variants, but tank steel isn't the only application. Modern ballistic steels for civilian uses, armored vehicles for VIPs, bank transport vehicles, secure rooms, all employ similar metallurgy. Krupp Industries itself, now ThyssenKrupp, still produces specialty steels based on their historical processes. Even in the construction industry, there are echoes. High-strength structural steels for skyscrapers sometimes use heat treatments. Inspired by tank steel technology, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the tallest building in the world, uses steels with selective hardening, a direct descendant of Krupp technology. The economic significance is enormous. The global market for specialty steels is over $100 billion per year. A significant portion of that are steels based on German metallurgical principles from the 1940s. The technical lesson: why was copying so difficult? Metallurgy is one of humanity's oldest sciences. People have been smelting metal for millennia. Why was this specific steel so hard to replicate? The answer lies in the complexity. Steelmaking isn't one process, but hundreds of simultaneous processes. Crystal structures form, atoms diffuse, stresses build up, all at the same time, all interacting with each other. The Germans had learned to control this complexity. Through decades of systematic trials, they had empirically found what worked, even if they didn't always know why. Modern metallurgy, with computer modeling and electron microscopes, can now explain what the Germans did. We now understand the atomic mechanisms behind face hardening. But in 1944, this understanding didn't exist. The Germans did it anyway. That's the lesson. Sometimes experience is more important than theory. The Germans had the experience. The Allies had to build it up over decades. The ethical consideration, technology without context. But we must acknowledge, this advanced steel was developed for war. Tiger tanks with Krupp steel killed thousands of Allied soldiers. The tanks were so superior that Allied soldiers often panicked when they saw a Tiger. The engineers at Krupp knew what their steel was used for. They developed it anyway. Some worked voluntarily, others under pressure from the Nazi regime. But the result was the same. Technology that made killing more efficient. After the war, some Krupp engineers justified themselves by saying they were metallurgists, not soldiers. They were just doing their jobs. But is that enough? Can engineers deny responsibility for the application of their inventions? This question has no easy answer. Technology is neutral. Its use is not. The same steel that protected tanks now protects security vehicles that save lives. But originally, it was developed for war. That's the uncomfortable truth of technical history. Many innovations arise from conflict, and we, the descendants, inherit these innovations with all the ethical complications. YouTube, super thanks, technical truth without glorification. This story is complex. It shows German metallurgical excellence, but also the use of that excellence for war. My goal is technical understanding, not glorification. I spend months in archives, studying metallurgical reports, speaking with the last living engineers. If you appreciate this detailed, ethically conscious technical history, support me with YouTube's Super Thanks. Every Super Thanks enables more archival work, more primary source research, more stories that connect technical truth with ethical reflection. The next generation of engineers needs both technical knowledge and ethical awareness. Krupp engineers created wonders of metallurgy, but these wonders serve destruction. We must learn and simultaneously remain critical. The final lesson: innovation takes time and responsibility. Dr. William Gowland, the British metallurgist, wrote in 1975, shortly before his death, "I have spent my life understanding German Krupp steel. Now, 30 years later, I understand it. But I also understand that true innovation cannot be copied. It must grow organically." Through years of systematic work, the Germans had those years. We had to recreate them. That's the reality of scientific progress. But I wish their brilliance had been used for peace, not for war. Today, when modern tanks roll, when armored vehicles protect VIPs, when specialty steels are used in buildings, we remember. This technology began in Essen, Germany, 1940 to 1944, developed by brilliant metallurgists for a terrible purpose. The technology survived, was transformed, and now serves protection as well. That's the complex legacy of Krupp steel, metallurgical excellence that took decades to understand and replicate. From war to peace, from destruction to protection, from German secret to global knowledge. Comment CTA, metallurgical knowledge. Which aspect of Krupp steel metallurgy fascinated you the most? Many engineers in the comments have shared technical details. Grandfathers who worked in steel mills. Company documents about heat treatment. Modern processes that use old principles. Do you have metallurgical family stories or professional experiences? Every technical comment helps document this complex history. Let's understand together how material science shaped history.